probably going to be difficult after that very interesting debate we just had. And thanks to Milan, Marji, and Taufik for giving us some interesting perspectives. The carbon credit, one thing that came to my mind while I was listening to that was, the deforestation and the carbon credit part, to Milan's point, is if I stood up and said, okay, I'm going to kill everybody in this room, and somebody comes and says, please don't kill the people, we'll give you money. That's carbon credits to me. It was interesting. Anyway, to our panel, we are basically talking about bankable, creating bankable atmosphere for solar projects in Malaysia. And so to me, that's basically a trilemma of creating energy, creating power that's affordable, sustainable, and reliable. It's a trilemma between policies, capacity restrictions, and the grid stability. It's a trilemma between tariff rates, between the cost or the capex, and the financing that we get, right? It's a debate between economies of scale, which says that you should go large as possible, to what Malaysia likes, which is spreading the wealth. And so keeps projects to be small so that everybody can participate and the wealth is spread. So with those kind of different ideas, different topics, what I wanted to do is first ask the panelists to introduce themselves, maybe a minute or so. Yeah, Borhang, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Borhong. I'm the head of business development and managing director at NEFIN. So we are a solar and renewable energy project developer and investor. For us, we invest and hold on to the assets. I think we have also talked about how there are different types of investors in the assets. And so we are a lifetime asset holder. After we invest in the asset, we hold on to the asset until the end of life. So bankability is a topic which we think about on a day-to-day basis.
Hello. Thanks, Kiran. Hi, my name is Faez. I'm a senior associate at Wong and Partners, which is a member firm of Baker McKenzie International. My specialization is projects and infrastructure, and I have been doing solar, I think, since LSS2, acting for both investors, developers, contractors, and also lenders. So bankability is one of the crux issues when we face during solar development projects.
Thanks. So my name is Kiran Jethwa. I'm from managing partner of Fumase. We are basically a developer and asset owner, just like what Borang just mentioned. We invest into projects, don't do CNI sector, but we are focused on utility scale, large scale projects. At a very high level, Fumase is a California, USA company, and we also have a Fumase Malaysia. We have a 47 megawatt solar project that was part of LSS2 in Perak that is operational now, and looking to develop more projects in renewable energy, water, waste, hydrogen sectors. So let's go straight into the discussion. The first and foremost, when it comes to bankability, what comes to your mind? Let's keep the discussion at a high level, and then we'll go deeper into each topic, right? So maybe Faez, if you want to start us off.
So I think bankability basically boils down to whether the project can be financed, typically by a third party and not by the investor itself. So which is why, in addition to sponsors getting the returns, they need to make sure that the project is financially sustainable for loan repayments.
Yeah, but I would add on that phrase to say that bankability is a lot about whether the project on a standalone basis is able to get finance, meaning not relying too much on the, let's say, the balance sheet of the sponsor. So in other words, for us, our standard on a bankable project would that it can get non-recourse project financing. This can be from banks or it can be from private lenders.
So basically, I'm not a very smart person, and so need to bring it down. There's a word, right? KISS, keep it simple. So at the end of the day, what is bankability? Bankability is basically making sure that the project is de-risked to the point that even a bank who is very conservative will finance that project. That is bankability, right? And so this concept of non-recourse finance, maybe Borang, you can give it a go first, and then what is the situation right now in Malaysia? What is happening?
Sure. So non-recourse project financing basically is that a project company on a standalone basis without guarantees from shareholders are able to get a bank loan or a third-party loan to finance the projects. Yeah. In other words, if the project is unable to make payments to the bank or to pay back the bank, the shareholders do not necessarily have to be liable for it. And I guess the current situation in Malaysia, my understanding is that there are very few real non-recourse project financing. And I think there are probably very, very few in the CNI sector.
Yep, and to add on that, typically I think the Malaysian scene it's limited recourse. From my experience at least, it's very rare you get true non-recourse. So you do need sponsor support at least until a certain period of the project, usually up until COD.
So let's go into the topic that was basically debated quite heavily in the last panel, and that's carbon tax and carbon credits. How is carbon credits helpful or make a project bankable? Faez, you want to start?
Thanks, Kiran. That's a good question, and I think it's going to be relevant, especially for VPPA. So historically, carbon credits, when it was introduced in Malaysia, was tradable. Then when the GET program came in, it sort of became semi or non-tradable. And with the introduction of the VPPA now, unfortunately, the guideline isn't clear on the characteristic or type of the REC. And one key, I think, bankability question would be whether the REC will be tradable or whether banks can take it as security. So that's something that hopefully the EC can clarify, because ultimately carbon credits have value. So when the banks, if in a situation of default, that would provide additional comfort or security to them.
On my end, my understanding of especially the VPPA program, which came out yesterday, is that carbon credits allow for example, like a contract for differences with a bankable off-taker, allowing a project to have much more predictable income, right? So for example, in the large-scale solar, you can have a fixed tariff with TNB, where TNB's balance sheet or credit worthiness is comfortable for the bank. In a situation where you do not have this, then what happens is that, for example, if you're selling under NEDA and trying to get a S&P, there is no certainty on your income, right? So REC, if you are able to sign a contract for differences with a bankable company, or credit-worthy company, that contract basically enables your project to be financed, because it then provides certainty into the income of the project.
But that's going to be interesting, right? Now, if we combine that discussion with the non-recourse financing discussion, NEDA is basically a merchant market, which means the revenues are uncertain. The carbon credits are also tradable. So that would also be somewhat uncertain. My experience discussing with commercial lenders has been they don't like merchant risk, all right? What they prefer is that the merchant risk should be typically below 30%. Now, if your whole project is 100% merchant, that's going to be very difficult to finance. So how do we go about that? How do we make it bankable?
Yeah, so in those situations, if you are relying on a purely a market pricing for your REC, then yes, it really doesn't solve the problem. But if there's a company who's willing to sign a contract for differences for the REC or the RECs, then effectively you are able to then lock in the net tariff of the solar project by adding the contract for differences for RECs and the SMP, and therefore creating bankable projects. The challenge is then who is willing to sign such a contract for differences, right? And even if some companies are willing to sign it, whether that provides sufficient comfort to banks in terms of the way that the contract is drafted, I think that's very much on Faez, like your expertise on it. And the other part is also the credit worthiness of that company signing the contract for differences.
I'll just add that it'll probably be more or less similar to CNI, where you will need some sort of support from the off-taker, payment guarantee. But on the other side of it, looking at the Malaysian electricity market, it has been fairly stable. So I think knowing how Malaysian banks are very supportive of Malaysian projects, they can probably take the view that the risk of price uncertainty or fluctuation isn't going to be so much. And be able to finance a project potentially with limited recourse.
When it comes to bankability, one of the biggest capex items is interconnection, right? And that can vary, the transmission line, what's the distance, and what's the actual cost of interconnection, and whether there is an interconnection available. Combine that with the VPPA policy that was declared yesterday. Combine that with the concept of solar park. What are your thoughts? Borang?
Yeah, I think the bankability of solar farms, that's an easier question to solve, because especially if the PPA itself is bankable, and usually the off-taker is bankable, then and then of course you have the commercial aspect, right? But generally speaking, is a more straightforward way to solve the bankability issues are not so severe for solar farms. However, it is not really so sustainable for a country to grow the solar industry purely through solar farms. So having a VPPA policy that allows for kind of like merchant market projects, and we also related to CNI projects to become more bankable, I think overall this kind of policy is moving in a direction that allows for a healthy and more sustainable growth of the solar industry.
No, what I was thinking is basically, what is a solar park? A solar park is where the government procures the land. Land acquisition is the biggest challenge for a solar, basically farm developer, right? And so if the government procures the land, 1,000 acres, 3,000 acres, whatever, and my concept is actually taking it to Malaysia itself, is from a federal level, they say to each state that you will make available this many acres, whatever acreage is available, you will provide the interconnection, and then basically make it an auction. Let's say the total capacity comes out to 200 megawatts for this one solar park in Selangor. Then they can auction off 10 megawatts, 20 megawatts, 30 megawatts, whatever it is, and let people compete on that. Would that not improve the bankability of the projects? That's number one. Number two is, now if we go with that kind of a strategy, right now what is happening with LSS program, LSS 1, 2, 3, 4, is most people gravitate towards the better solar radiation states, right? And what ends up happening is solar developers start putting up substations wherever it's necessary. And so there is no long-term strategy from a TNB perspective to say the grid is created in such a way that it is long-term. But now if we go with the strategy of each state, basically makes land available and creates solar park, now that solar capacity is distributed throughout the whole country. Faez?
Thanks, Kiran. I think I agree with you. I think solar farm will definitely, or the concept that you propose will definitely help in terms of bankability. Because one of the key bankability issues in developing utility scale solar is land. I think this was mentioned during one of the sessions earlier. Finding land, making sure that you can develop or the land categories suitable for development. And if you get the state involved, you also have an ally in terms of getting the relevant permits, getting all the sort of governmental issues sorted, right? And you can get the cost of the tariff cost a lot lower because you take out a huge capex component. So it definitely will make it bankable. Whether or not that will happen, I think we've seen examples. Johor tried to I think, create a solar farm, but that was quickly rebutted by the federal government. But this is something I think the government can consider, for sure.
I would have quite a different thinking, a different opinion on this. I'm more of like a free market guy. I don't believe that government involving or intervening with the markets to this extent. I mean, the kind of model that you are talking about is basically the government is already the market maker and they determine the entire market. So I don't think that is too good for a healthy development and sustainable development of the industry. I think liberalization of the energy market is the way to go. So allowing the generator to directly work with the final off-taker on power plant constructions and planning, I think that is the way to go. The government can have certain quota limits to provide a framework, but providing a fixed capacity, certain locations, and then a race to zero on the pricing, I don't think that's the way to go.
I love this. Debate is always good. This is great, right? But the structure that VPPA that has right now, to me, it's going to create issues because depending upon the NEDA pricing that you get, now the difference has to be paid by the off-taker. And that on a day-to-day basis, who's going to keep track of that thing, and how do you make sure that you're not overcharging or undercharging and all of that, invoicing essentially, right? So it's going to be quite interesting how it moves forward. And go ahead.
Let me add a bit on that. Like I think the issue on the NEDA pricing, first, this means that government policy can severely affect what the SMP is. And this also means that it is very difficult for private market players to have a forecast on what is the future SMP going to be. So the lack of transparency into the SMPs, the way that it's calculated, and also the forecast on SMP means that signing a contract for differences become increasingly risky or costly for off-takers, and I think that is quite key. So from what I've seen, and especially what I understand from the market in India, is that transparency into the mechanism and also visibility into forecast of the SMP or merchant market prices is crucial to enabling a model like the VPPA.
Faez, your thoughts? Yeah, legal.
Yep. I just want to add to that essentially, like obviously price uncertainty and getting revenue is a big concern. But the other concern is that for VPPA, you're not entering into the normal PPA that's been bankable all these years. Right? You don't have comfort. I'm assuming you won't have comfort such as termination payments. So the banks will probably look at this in a different way. And the other condition that I thought was a bit weird was that apparently in the guidelines you can only obtain financing from local institutions. So again, that closes the market to get better financing rates. As we know, solar is mostly driven with USD costs. So it'll be interesting to see how this pans out. But I think ultimately, one once the first financier goes ahead and achieves financial close, I think the rest will follow.
Yeah, the key word is going to be, it's going to be interesting. So, quick question. Large-scale solar, the program that it was, versus VPPA, which one do you prefer from a bankability perspective?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the tried and tested one will be the large-scale solar, right? Even with its challenges, even with the risks that it still poses, again, it's tried and tested. So many projects have achieved financial close, so whereas the VPPA, again, will be interesting to see how it works.
Yeah, I think no doubt if you ask any bank, the bank will say that large-scale solar makes their job much easier, right? Any deviation from that, the more moving parts or the more free market-driven the project is, then of course there are more things to de-risk, essentially, right? But as I've expressed, I do think that that is the way forward, that is sustainable.
No, I mean, it just increases new nuances. Now you have to look into the credit risk for large scale of that off-taker, and then the whole CFD mechanism. All right, let's switch gears a little bit. So Malaysia wants to get net zero by 2050. Right, that is what has been declared, and quite a few countries have done that. And Malaysia is not the only country who's guilty of this. But what is the roadmap? How are we going to achieve that net zero by 2050? What is the roadmap where X coal-fired power plant will be decommissioned with this much capacity, and that capacity now has to be replaced by renewables? Where is that roadmap? There is no roadmap, right? At the same time, there is another policy that is needed, which is around energy storage. We all know solar, wind, renewable power is intermittent. Without a policy on energy storage, the grid becomes unstable. And we need to basically be able to have a stable grid that is sustainable. So going back to our bankability discussions on solar, how would energy storage play, or a policy around energy storage come into play?
So, I mean, energy storage is not something new. Obviously, in Malaysia, it's still underdeveloped. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to cost. It's still not commercially feasible to undertake energy storage in Malaysia. And that boils down to lack of government incentives. I think that's the first and foremost. If you want to develop any new technology, any new area, you know, the first sort of market or stakeholder that has to get involved is the government. But then when you talk about putting battery storage, I mean, if you're putting new battery storage in a new project, I think that's less of an issue because you can build your tariff, you can build your cost to index tariff. But what would happen if you were to build energy storage in existing LSS farms, for example? The tariff that you get is fixed for 21 years. The cost of energy storage, how are you then going to recover it, right? Because I don't, you know, TNB is unlikely going to pay additional to cover the cost of the battery storage over and above what's agreed in the PPA. So these are the things that needs to be considered. And right now, we can only look at LSS because they've already been commissioned, operational, and they're the best place to put in energy storage, at least for the short term, until newer projects start becoming commercially operational in the next 2 to 3 years.
On the energy storage front, I think the first thing is that before we even talk about the commercial viability of energy storage, first is whether the products are even bankable, right? Like, for example, even in solar, it took, I mean, decades before, and then slowly certain products become bankable, and then there are a list of products that are not bankable, right? I mean, a list of manufacturers. So there has to be development on the manufacturing end of it, that banks get comfortable with the product or the system that they're investing in. And this has to be backed by, for example, insurance companies who are willing to back warranties by manufacturers. Yeah. On the second part is on the commercial viability of batteries, like Faez has mentioned. I mean, a battery system adds costs and adds stability to a renewable energy system, but it doesn't generate any energy, right? So it's not generating revenue outright. If you look at some of the other markets, some ideas on how we could potentially do it includes the utility paying for a capacity, using the storage capacity of the batteries. Of course, there's a cost to this, but then this is not the first time that we are talking about, for example, the utility willing to pay a higher price for, let's say, renewable energy in order to promote it, right? Just like the FIT back then. But what happens is that this cost gets passed down to the end consumers through additional surcharge or something like that, yeah. But I mean, like Kiran said, if we want to get to net zero means you have to generate, I mean, we are going to continue using energy and we're going to use more and more energy, right? And that means this energy has to be generated carbon free, and the way to be able to do that in a sustainable way, there are only two ways to do it. One is to have storage, the other is to have an international grid where you are able to load balance with your neighbors.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about, to Faez's point, I wasn't thinking about existing LSS projects adding energy storage, because that, just the logistics of accounting would be too much. But going forward, maybe, what you were saying, Borang, was absolutely correct, that solar 10 years, 15 years back is where energy storage is today, right? It's going through the same cost curves. From what I'm hearing right now is the authorities are saying we won't think about any policy around energy storage until 2030, because that's when we expect the cost of energy storage to come down. But that's a chicken and egg situation, right? Unless there's a policy. And Borang, I think you made the point that basically there needs to be some kind of subsidy to kickstart any sector, right? And that's what we did with the FIT program in 2010 or around that time frame, right? And that's how kickstarted the whole solar industry, that we have such a huge conference with so many people here. Energy storage is at the same point. We need an FIT to kickstart the energy storage. And then the question becomes, okay, is it around ancillary services, which can be standalone battery storage, which Australia is doing quite a few projects like that, Neon project and etc. There are so many of those. And that seems like a very interesting way of stabilizing the grid. The other option could be the VPPA program that we have, or at least announced, is all based upon baseload power, let's say. Because at the end of the day, the demand, energy efficiency is great. People can improve the utilization of energy. But at the same time, everybody, human beings in general, need their showers to be hot, which means you need electricity, right? So from that perspective, I think Malaysia desperately needs a policy around energy storage. And the cost will come down, just like any other sector. Any other thoughts on energy storage before we move on?
I think, just to add, policy is one thing, and also I guess the will. For example, in LSS4 and also this VPPA, they're encouraging the use of battery storage, but it's just encouraging. It's not a mandatory requirement, right? Because I think maybe they also know that it's not going to be commercially feasible if they do make it mandatory. Like I said, the policy needs to be in place, because when the time comes, and hopefully soon, everything will just move on smoothly.
One thing that you just mentioned, right? You mentioned it just naturally, which is battery storage. Let's combine that with the previous panel, nature-based solutions, right? So when it comes to energy storage, there are so many different forms of energy storage. Battery is just a chemical storage, right? Then there is thermal storage, and then there is gravity-based storage. Any thoughts around those?
I think the other sort of way Malaysia is looking at to reduce carbon emissions, and they're going quite aggressively, is carbon capture, right, which is, again, one form of energy storage, if you can call carbon energy. But essentially, that's, I guess in the short term, that's going to be feasible, given that we are an oil and gas producing country. So I think that's going to be sort of the after hydrogen, that's probably on par with hydrogen. I think that's going to be sort of the next wave in terms of alternative ways to reduce carbon.
I think we talked about this a little bit in the morning, so for example, hydrogen, that is an area, so for energy storage or international trading of renewable energy, right? But considering the energy density that we have to achieve to have energy storage on the large scale, and also the currents that we have to run, the reaction times have to be very fast. Generally speaking, from my understanding, battery storage would be currently the most feasible.
Yeah, I think also from a ramp up and down perspective, batteries work the best. But I think some of the gravity-based solutions that are out there could be quite interesting, and that becomes a nature-based solution. There's another concept that India has introduced as a policy, and that is power banking. Are you familiar with it? Oh. So power banking is basically you produce renewable power during the daytime, put it on the grid, and then the grid becomes your battery, becomes your energy storage, and then you can claim that power back in the evening. So for example, if you get into a VPPA structure and you basically say, I will give you this many units, kilowatt hours, 1,000 kilowatt hours, whatever it is, you put 1,000 kilowatt hours during the day, or maybe 2,000, and then you recover something back to provide it to your client. So the grid becomes your energy storage essentially, which is a very interesting concept. And what they do is they basically say you can bank it for up to a month. Beyond that, you lose it essentially. So if you don't claim it, you lose it.
Sure, I think there's also an opposite of this, which are actually being seen already in some markets. So other than the merchant market for renewable energy or solar energy, there's also a merchant market for battery capacity, where the utility can pay you to use your batteries to store energy in order to stabilize the grid and then also to take the energy back out. Yeah, that is an interesting point, that then there is the other business model where in the merchant market, but for example, when the energy is cheap, then you can buy it and you can sell it when it's more expensive, right? Yeah, so I guess this is called time shifting, I think, right? Battery time shifting, but I'm also, we have explored that. That is also a commercially challenging model, and also basically like the VPPA kind of model, you require very transparent merchant market pricing and calculation mechanism, and able to forecast it in the future.
So I was given the cue. We have less than 5 minutes left now. So maybe keeping the topic in mind, bankability, improving bankability, any parting thoughts, policies that we need, or any comments that you may have?
Well, I think one of the major challenges, at least from what banks have informed me, is that in relation to, obviously this has not been there's not been an example yet, but when it comes to enforcement of a solar project, it's not as easy as it is, because you have to go through the added layer of getting approval. Right, so I think that's still one of the key areas where our PPAs can be improved on, in terms of if there is a financier and they want to sell the project because of a default, they should sort of allow it without approval, for example, or notification, so that removes the uncertainty, because whenever the banks ask us, will Energy Commission give approval, we can never say yes or guarantee say yes. So if that's one thing that I'll leave this for people's thoughts, probably with that.
You mean change in ownership of I see. I think on bankability, especially on the PPA and the legal aspect, for the market to have have a better understanding of PPA clauses. The issue in the market very often is that because there can be many investors or developers competing for a project, sometimes when customers are asking for unreasonable or completely unprotected clauses in the PPA, that certain developers out of desperation to get a project will simply accept it, creating a very messy market in terms of how the PPAs are drafted. I think if there are better standards or certain international standards or local standards to standardize the PPA drafts, this would greatly improve the bankability of projects.
From my perspective, I think what we need is, number one, if Malaysia says we want to be net zero by 2050, what's the roadmap? Which means year 2025, which coal-fired power plant is getting decommissioned? What is the capacity? And how is that capacity being replaced with renewables? So that's number one. Number two would be a policy around energy storage, and basically make it as an ancillary services to begin with, and also make it part of the solar project, whatever it may be. But at least we need a start on the energy storage journey now, as opposed to waiting until 2030, 2035, whatever it may be. The third, we need a policy around hydrogen. Hydrogen basically helps abate certain sectors like industrial sectors that are hard to abate with just scope 2 electricity emissions, right? There are also scope 1 emissions we have to worry about. And that's what's needed. Then as far as bankability of solar projects itself are concerned, the concept of solar park does make sense, even though, Borang, you said no, open markets, so be it. But the challenge there, to me at least, right, is land acquisition. And if we de-risk the land acquisition, de-risk the infrastructure, then basically the tariff rates can come down. And that's what's needed, right? And then it's competing on equal footing. The only thing left to de-risk at that point is your cost of capital. And different people have different structures, so maybe that's the other thing. One last thing to add would be Philippines has just announced that they will allow 100% foreign ownership on renewable energy projects. If Malaysia as a country becomes very protectionist and say, nope, we need to protect people here in Malaysia, that's only going to take foreign capital away from Malaysia into countries like Philippines. And so I think the original structure of 5149 works. If not, make it 100%, but make it free market. And that's where, Borang, I agree with you. Free markets definitely drive the costs down and let everybody compete. With that, I think we are out of time. So please help me thank the panelists and their opinions. Thank you.